Welcome to chapter 8. In this opening paragraph, Lizzie is joining the rest of the Bingley party for dinner because remember, she is there at their house checking in on Jane as she is sick. And the opening paragraph does a great job of showing the character of these characters. And she's joining the party with there's an inpouring of civil inquiries about Jane, and she is very much pleased that the superior solicitude is coming from Mr. Bingley. But the point of this paragraph that I want to point out is the Bingley sisters, and it's done in a way, the language, that you can almost miss it, but it is showing us slash kind of directly telling us that the Bingley sisters are very surface level, that everything that they do is an act, and a lot of times it's to help themselves, even if it means, putting on an appearance of caring. It's just to make themselves look better, but nothing about them is actually genuine. And again, that's probably why Darcy ended up falling for Lizzie instead of Caroline, because Lizzie is genuine about everything that she does. And the line I want to point out is that the sisters, on hearing this repeated 3 or 4 times, how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves. Again, bringing the information back to themselves. So like, oh yes, we know how it feels. It's so terrible. And it's a polite conversation to be having. To continue, and then thought no more the matter, and their indifference towards Jane, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth to the enjoyment of all her original dislike. And I love that she at least put an effort. Maybe she was wrong because Jane's like, oh no, they're sweet, they're darlings, I like them. But Lizzie clocked them immediately and doubted herself because it seemed like the sisters did like Jane. So she was like, if you like Jane, maybe this is a good sign, but then sees that they don't really care for Jane, except for what she can be used as a prop to help themselves, as I was previously saying. And so she goes back to her dislike of them, that she'll tolerate them civilly. But it's fascinating that unless it's directly in front of them, they completely forget about Jane's sickness and move on to conversations. The next paragraph quickly summarizes what this dinner party feels like, in the sense that Lizzie says that the only one that genuinely cares about Jane is Mr. Bingley, and he actually genuinely talks to her. It makes her feel included, makes her feel less like an intruder to this party as the others make her feel, and continues by saying that, like, Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy, her sister scarcely less so, and as for Mr. Hurst, by whom Elizabeth sat, he was an indolent man who lived only to eat, drink, and play at cards, who, when he found her prefer a plain dish to a ragout, had nothing to say to her, which a ragout, I learned there's a podcast that digs into like very niche little things of Jane Austen and talks about the history and things like that. I'll put a little picture here to show you what I'm talking about. Highly recommend. It's been very informative for me too. The dish is a French dish. It's very rich. It's very popular at the time. Meanwhile, Lizzie liking a plain dish is to refer to a country dish, a simple dish. And so Mr. Hurst does not care for her because to him it's just, she is simple, boring country. And Mr. Hurst and his wife, the older Bingley sister, make a great pair, even though they equally don't make a great pair, because all they care about is fashionable things and fashionable people, and they kind of dismiss those who are not within that category, or they deemed within that category. And in the end, though, they're both kind of miserable because they're so surface level. There's nothing deeper within the relationship besides the surface level of appearances. Whereas at least like Lizzie and Darcy are going to have a deeper relationship because they have more to them, more likes, dislikes, and being genuine. And so that I love the Hurst couple kind of being a foil to the other relationships, even Jane and Bingley's relationship. One of the many reasons why I think Pride and Prejudice is still relevant to today is that the characters are familiar to who people we recognize in real life. And now I just want to say that like there are many reasons why Pride and Prejudice has stuck around for so long. And actually, I highly recommend checking out Jane Austen's bookshelf. I read and listened to the audiobook of this. Is a nonfiction book done by an antiques book dealer, digging into the female authors that inspired Jane Austen. And each chapter digs into the author's life and their works and things like that, but also looking at why they didn't continue their success, because they were successful, whereas Jane Austen's success continued to today. But getting back, the reason why, one of the many reasons why I think it's relevant to today is the characters are familiar, such as the Bingley sisters. Like the moment that Lizzie leaves, Miss Bingley begins abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She has no conversation and style, no taste, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst, though, about the same, and added, she has nothing in short to recommend her. So these two women we probably can easily recognize as someone we've interacted in our lives, and not just women but men too. This like idea of tearing someone else down to raise yourself, but in actuality it doesn't work like that. It actually looks poorly upon you, reflects poorly on your own character that you do that. But yet we've all done it ourselves, even if we don't want to admit it. And we all know people who are like that. That everyday moment of life, like that they just exist in like these two sisters. And we have to remember that the Bennets are known as the beauties of the community. So the two sisters are trying to raise themselves to the others and kind of be soothed, almost like have the others agree that, of course, they are the higher society. Because remember, their father was a merchant. They're kind of new, whereas at least the Bennets is generational landowners, like daughters of gentlemen. And so they have more that they have to prove. And so they're trying to force it a little bit more. But I also want to point out Miss Bingley saying that she is a mixture of pride and impertinence, talking about Lizzie. And to me, that stands out because often we don't realize that Lizzie is, that we often forget because I don't think it's pointed out as obviously as Lizzie points out Mr. Darcy's pride, but Lizzie is proud. And we can probably surmise from just this piece of conversation that there is a tidbit of truth that led to Caroline saying this. That probably during this dinner, Lizzie held herself and interacted with others with a sort of coldness, a sort of pride. And we see that with in like in between conversations and the other interactions in the previous chapters, that she's a little proud, and that's why she's standoffish to other people. Like, she can be warm and welcoming and loving, but she is very standoffish to others. And probably, like Lizzie said in the beginning of the chapter, that she goes back to her disregard of the sisters, seeing that they don't really care about Jane. She probably then was equally cold to them. And so they think that she is being proud, that she's proud of herself, and that she has this pride, even though she doesn't deserve this pride because she's just a lowly country daughter of a gentleman, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of layers, but that's why Pride and Prejudice is not just about Darcy's pride. It's about Lizzie's pride. And Lizzie's pride also has to be pointed out and go through change. As Mr. Darcy, that whole first botch engagement, it's not just her pointing out his pride and him turning around. He points out her pride, and she has to address it too. So far throughout this journey, you've been seeing me read Pride and Prejudice with my Penguin Cloth bound edition of this book, and you can see I have the box set of it. And the others have done well. I've read them before, but my Pride and Prejudice edition, the like pages are coming out like by signatures. If you bookbind, you might know what I'm talking about. It's a little annoying, and I need to fix this. But it's perfect timing because I just got a new, very beautiful edition of Pride and Prejudice that I'm going to be switching to reading, and it is by Teresa Vu, or Peachy Mocho, which I'll tag her down below. You can find her on TikTok and Instagram. She's an artist I've actually worked with to bind a Regency version of a Hermione fic. She did the cover art for me and the end pages, and it's truly beautiful. And this not only is a exceptionally beautiful edition, I'll show you more as I am reading like the naked cover and the illustrated pages that she's done in between. Like, this is beautifully illustrated. It's an illustrated edition of the book. I can't wait to show you it as I'm reading. But with that being said, let's get back into chapter 8. So the first sentence of today's reading starts with Mr. Bingley's response to his sister's censure of Lizzie Bennet, where he says, "Your picture may be exact, Louisa," said Bingley, "but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice." And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because I just love how subtly it is inferring to the readers the character of these characters. It's inferring to us how the Bingley sisters focus on the exterior, how one dresses or acts, not realizing that how they act are kind of low class almost. It's not how the epitome of what a good gentle man or gentle lady should be, which is what Bingley is representing. And we have to remember also during this time, for stories to be published, and especially for stories to be published and put in young ladies' hands, there had to be a sense of morality to it, a sense of improving one's character. It's a little different than, say, Wuthering Heights, which is what I'm reading right now, which is showing much more the evils and the worst of society. So Bingley is supposed to represent what a gentleman should be like, a very kind man, a selfless man. You know, as Mr. Bennet says later, that Jane and Bingley will exceed their income because they're too good. But also, Bingley does not take notice of things like Lizzie's outfit. He is focusing too much on the person herself standing there. And it's also fascinating because that is Lizzie's flaw in part, because she focuses on the exterior of Mr. Darcy because of how he presents himself. She doesn't notice the interior, but it's also Darcy's doing that he kind of does this. There's a lot going on, but I think it's also Jane Austen is trying to point out that one's exterior does not always match one's interior, things like this. There's a lot that you can just pick apart with just a simple sentence as this. Caroline then responds with, "You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure," said Miss Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "Certainly not." There are a couple things I want to point out here. So one is Caroline roping Mr. Darcy in to be like, look, we think alike. We should obviously get married. Like that kind of logic that she's been doing. And bringing Lizzie down, because remember, like I said, the Bennet sisters are kind of dubbed the beauties of the community, of the county, of the town. And so she wants to ensure her place in Darcy's eyes by bringing Lizzie down, pointing out her flaws, be like, don't even look away. Pay attention to me. But the other thing about this is Mr. Darcy agreeing. And the reason why Mr. Darcy is agreeing is that he is not foolish like Bingley to ignore the importance of appearances. That is why he does act within the ideas of societal expectations and the way he dresses and presents himself. And it may come across as proud, but he's just following what is expected for someone of his status. Because that is still kind of important. Like he recognizes that, like, of course, he want his sister to walk around the country in covered in mud, because then one may frown upon and make assumptions about her sister, as the Bingleys are doing about Lizzie. And so then you're getting this wonderful kind of conversation of that you should really look at one's interior. However, because of the society that we do live in, one's appearance does play an important role, unfortunately. Like I've mentioned many times, there's this foiling, this mirroring, how many of the characters are very similar, and it's to show then the hypocrisy of things or to illustrate other things, or in this case, Miss Caroline Bingley saying to walk 3 miles or 4 miles or 5 miles or whatever it is above her ankles in dirt and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum. It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing, said Bingley. And it's what I'm trying to point out is that this one interaction, this one action, these two are making assumptions of her character, just as Lizzie had done with Mr. Darcy. Based off one interaction with him that first night, she has now decided his entire personality, doing something very similar that Caroline is doing, but with a very different, but at the same time, very different than what Caroline's doing, because Caroline obviously has a motive behind what her speech right now, but she's making an assumption, pointing out that she's not like us, that she has this conceited independence, which does not fit within the ideas of what a young lady of society should be like, which I think is Jane Austen critiquing those assumptions, because she would have been conceited, would have been perceived as a conceited independent country folk herself. Indifference to decorum, things like that. So again, you're having this conversation between town and country, the different societies and the level of upholding decorum and things like that. But Bingley then is pointing out that this brief interaction has a different interpretation to him. He interprets it that like it's showing that she obviously loves her sister. And so, again, Jane Austen very brilliant is pointing out that one action, one interaction, one speech could be interpreted by people very differently, even though it's the same. And it's the same with, like, Caroline singing Darcy's proudness as a good thing in the first dance, whereas Lizzie was offended by it. Or even Charlotte kind of justifying Darcy's action that night, whereas Lizzie being offended by it. So, like, that's the whole point of this book, I think. Like, not the whole point, but one aspect of the book is to kind of show, again, that one's actions can be interpreted in many different ways. And I think it's down to, like, the people, like, themselves and how they interpret it. And again, it's showing Bingley in a very pleasing light, that he is acknowledging the truth of the situation, which is that Lizzie is showing how much she loves her sister, because he is looking at her character instead of the exterior appearances and manners and things like that. So very subtly and like in very brief moments up to this point, we've been seeing how Mr. Darcy actually is intrigued by Lizzie despite his initial comment about not standing up with her for the dance, that he's been hovering around her, close to her at other occasions where they like paths cross, or they're at the same party. But here you see much more obviously when Miss Bingley says, "Mr. Darcy, I'm afraid, Mr. Darcy, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." And he responds with, "Not at all." And that's to show that, like, even though he agreed with her previously that he would not want his sister to act this way, it has not affected his opinion of Lizzie at this moment in time, that he actually still admires her and finds her rather lovely. There's more you can unpack here, but that's just my first thought. Is it's showing kind of also this hypocrisy that he expects his sister to uphold the standards, but is rather pleased by Lizzie not doing it, or at least he probably sees it in the way that Bingley does, where it shows her love towards her sister. There's so many ways you can interpret Darcy's impression, and I would love to hear how you might interpret Darcy's reaction here in this moment in time. By the way, this is the same book as yesterday. It's just the naked edition of it. It is absolutely gorgeous. Like, the quality is so fine. This is probably one of the nicest books I own. This is truly, it was worth the money. It was worth the Kickstarter, worth the time. She did an exceptional job. And if you want to know or see more about the book itself and the interior and all the little details that she put in this, I have a video posted over on TikTok. And if you're wondering why I'm talking weird like this, if you're seeing this video on TikTok, it's because these particular videos I post both on my TikTok and on my YouTube. And that's why I have like a weird thing where I talk about videos I have on YouTube and stuff like that. If you're wondering, it's because I post these particular literary analysis on both platforms. I'm trying to branch off a little bit. I'm trying to explore different avenues, if that makes sense. Picking up where we left off, we have Mrs. Harris saying, "I have excessive regard for Miss Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it. I think I heard you say that their uncle is an attorney on Meryton." "Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside." Now, the reason why I'm pointing out the comments by these two sisters is, one is that they recognize that they cannot attack Jane the same way that they can Lizzie. Because Jane, as I previously mentioned in a different video, is the epitome of what the female main character was of that time, what they would have wanted the female main character to be beautiful and kind and angelic and moral, and, like, if she has any flaws, it's down to her naivety. That's not really flawed. Not like Lizzie is flawed with her pride, things like that. And so Jane would have been the main character if someone else at that time had written it. She would have been kind of more like Evelina by Frances Burney. But, so that's why they can't tear her down, because it's a little hard. However, they can tear her down based off her connections. And it's showing that this, like, a horrible kind of thing of, like, you're not alone in the society. The society is set up where, like, even when you walk in, often you need, like, an introduction by someone else, a verification almost, or A letter of recommendation is another thing that was common of that time, of like someone that knows the people, that community that also knows you, sending a letter being like, I recommend this person, you should get to know them. And that's why also in a different video I've talked about with the history that Jane Austen had written on my YouTube, I talked about how the military in Wickham is a unique circumstance where they could come into these communities without these letters of recommendation, that they can almost start over and then have this guise of being like knights, being good, being part of the, the military. And meanwhile, people like Jane might have so much to help her, to show that she's a great person, but her family can bring her down, which is actually something that is common to Evelina. That was a thing about Evelina, that she's afraid that her love interest would never go for her because she is not only an orphan, but the only living connection she has is one French, which again, this time period, not very big thing, but also very crass and abrasive. And her other cousins are very low class compared to Lord Orville. So you see some like influence from Evelina by Frances Burney with Jane Austen, which if you want to know more about other things that possibly influenced Jane Austen, what books were on her shelf, I highly recommend checking out Jane Austen's bookshelf. I just read / also listened to the audiobook of that nonfiction by a antique book dealer. Excellent, highly recommend. But getting back to what I was saying, the reason why they then pinpoint her family is to then bring her down, being like, look, she's not in the same class of us, being hypocritical themselves, because that was the class that they're technically from. Their father was a merchant. He just made enough money where now they can become gentlemen and gentle daughters. It's so funny that they're trying to bring her down because of her family connections when they themselves are very kind of new money, you could say. So that's why I wanted to point this out. It's the hypocrisy of the sisters. And it's very similar to Mrs. Bennet, as I previously pointed out too, that Mrs. Bennet, that is her family, but she sees herself as better than, say, the Lucases, even though she herself has brothers who are still in trade. By the way, from that last clip, I hope that everyone could follow me. This is just how my brain works. It kind of works like a Wikipedia rabbit hole, where you do like that thing where you find one thing and then you go to the next thing and you kind of zigzag a bit. That's just how my brain works. I hope that made sense. I apologize. I do have ADHD, but it's just there's so many connections, so many things that branch off from one simple line, as I've pointed out many times so far in these videos. Mr. Bingley then responds to his sister's comment about Jane's family, because that's the only thing that they could do to like kind of tear her down because she's the epitome of goodness, is that he says, if they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, cried Bingley, it would not make them one jot less agreeable. And this is the brilliance of Jane Austen, is that she very subtly, kind of on a platter, serves off to the side, like almost like a waiter, like walking around the room, these moral lessons or moral conversations that could be had with the readers without it being in your face like maybe some other books of her time would be like, or even today. She very subtly is kind of showing the readers, with this conversation being had between the Bingley siblings, the idea of one deciding one's character based on exterior things versus interior. So exterior being like how they dress, their class, their family, dictating that person themselves, assuming that they would be lesser because they are not of their class, assuming that someone of a higher class would be a better person when that is obviously not the case. And Bingley is showing what would be the correct answer to this argument that she's trying to have, which is that you should look at the person individually, because individually, despite, say, their family or their circumstances, can still be an infinitely better person than, say, the Bingley sisters themselves. This person could be kind and good and bring so much more joy and happiness to you. So it's her having a conversation of people making assumptions that based off class, based off family, you assume someone's goodness when that's not always the case. And I like it's refreshing because she's writing of country life. She's writing the small corner life, like a small town kind of life. And she's trying to point out that just, to modernize it, it would be saying that people who come from cities, suburbs are inferior. No, those who come from small towns are inferior to those from cities and suburbs. That's what I'm trying to say. But that's not the case. You can have terrible people in both places, and you can have really good, kind people in both places. And you got to look at them individually and not just their environment or the people around them, even though the people around them and the environment can influence them. So I like she's having a nature versus nurture kind of conversation, but also this conversation of looking at the person individually, because it could be a diamond in the rough kind of situation. Again, very much seeing a similarity to Frances Burney's Evelina here. Mr. Darcy then joins this argument being had between the Bingley siblings, where on one side is the Bingley sisters saying that, despite Jane being extremely beautiful and kind and angelic, she's going to have this kind of glass ceiling because of her social, standing in her family. They're going to prohibit her from marrying too well. Whereas then Mr. Bingley is saying that no, her personality and her character and her individually is exceptional, and everything else shouldn't matter. Mr. Darcy then comes in and says, but it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world. Now, on surface level, I think it does seem like he agrees with the Bingley sisters. However, to me, in my interpretation, and again, the fun thing about analysis is that you can interpret things many different ways, and that's why books like this, where it's just presenting the dialogue and the actions more so, and less the interior motives and things, leaves a lot of room for readers to then make their own interpretations. I think Darcy's walking in the middle of this argument, that he's recognizing that the decorum and etiquette of society is like a straitjacket, and there's a reason why he gravitates and is infatuated with Lizzie, because she kind of snubs her nose at it slightly, but not too much. And that's the thing that you need to do, is that you need to kind of walk in the middle ground, that you can kind of snub and be frustrated with some of these things, but simultaneously, because you're existing in this society, you kind of have to recognize some of these rules. That he's recognizing that Jane and Lizzie might have great personalities, but their background will cause gossip, will cause conversations, may have a sad outcome. And it's a conversation that Jane Austen has in, for example, Mansfield Park with the sisters and how they married, and even in Persuasion, for example. But I would love to know what you guys think is Darcy's interpretation of this argument, if you agree with me or if you think he's saying something else. One of the reasons why I adore the Bingley sisters is because they feel so real. Like, you've come across people just like them. And it's a reason why I think a lot of girls who are teenagers or in their young adulthood that read this book end up falling in love, is because they see a lot of similarities here to their own real lives, coming across people very similar despite the centuries difference. And you're seeing it here with the sisters indulging their mirth for some time at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they returned to her room on leaving the dining room, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. And first off, they only went there because etiquette dictated that they had to leave that room and entertain themselves till the coffee hour, and they didn't know what else to do, so they just went to Jane to put on this performance. And you can see it's very surface level, but getting back to what I was first saying, in your own life that you have come across people who will tear into other people behind closed doors, but then put on a whole act of loving them to their face. And it's very a selfish act, and it's showing also the surface, like they're very surface level people. And it makes me sad when I think of like the adaptations of these, where they don't really show this as much. Like, I think the 1995 version showed a little bit the sisters being by her bedside, but they don't really show the media juxtaposition of like them tearing into her and then immediately going to her bedside. And the reason why I like wish that they did that was because I think, one, it shows people like you don't want to be like them, obviously. Like, they're terrible people, to encourage you not to act like that. Like, it's a great lesson for people to learn, like, you don't want to be like these people. But also, like, it just makes me sad because I understand in adaptations they have to focus on like the main characters, and often they're focusing on Lizzie, Darcy, Bingley, and Jane. Like, even Lydia, who does involve in the conflict, doesn't really get much dynamic to her in adaptations. But like the Bingleys, especially the sisters, are the ones that are going to be dwindled down, and often the one sister is cut. And it's sad because they are, I think, very dynamic, and like I said, they foil with a lot of other characters and add a lot of moral lessons to them. So that's why I'm focusing on the Bingley sisters a lot here, because they are interesting and they think they are the main characters of their own stories. And that's what makes it, all the characters in this book very fascinating, that I think you forget because you're focusing so much on Lizzie and Darcy upon first read, that these other characters are equally dynamic and equally bring such interesting lessons and conversations. And I just love the Bingleys because they're so terrible too. Again, the reason why I love authors like Jane Austen is that they're doing a lot of showing and not telling. They're giving action and they're giving dialogue and allowing us then to pick it apart if we so choose to, which obviously I so choose to. And case in point with Lizzie coming down, seeing that they're playing a card game and assuming that they're playing high, decides to read using her sister as an excuse during this limited time that she's spending in the room with them. And Mr. Hurst looks with astonishment and says, "Do you prefer to reading to cards? That is rather singular." And to that, you can infer that he and the Bingley sisters are very focused on people and what other people think, being a part of the crowd, being part of society. Whereas Lizzie, you can infer, has this independence or conceited independence, as Caroline, I think, described her as, where she is kind of snubbing her nose at society as something, but really she's actually abiding by a lot of the rules of society, but snubs it in certain places. She walks that line pretty well, but not perfectly, as I was mentioning previously. But I like this brief sentence and this brief action actually perfectly represents these characters and their viewpoints and outlooks, that Mr. Hurst and the Bingley sisters think too much of what other people think and how they present themselves, including their actions, whereas Lizzie doesn't, and is fine doing a solitary act, but also she's improving her mind, whereas the others are not. And it's this conversation of thinking too much about society, and this whole thing about the conversation at the time about being well read not being a good thing, that sometimes people praise that they aren't well read and things like that. And again, you're seeing a similar discourse going on today, this praise of oh, I'm not that well read, versus people praising how much they are well read. But that's what I wanted to point out, was that single line kind of encompasses each of these characters' personality. And to continue what I had just previously said about a single action and dialogue telling us a lot more if you stop to read between the lines, we have then Miss Bingley saying, "Miss Eliza Bennet despises cards. She is a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else." "I deserve neither such praise nor censure," cried Elizabeth. "I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things." The reason why I want to point this out is that Caroline is making an assumption of Lizzie's entire character based off one action. And this is actually very ironic, because Lizzie did that based off one action about Mr. Darcy. She has then surmised his personality and decided she does not like him. And it takes a rather long time for him to kind of change her mind about things. More actions needed to be shown for her to believe that she was wrong. But it's funny that Caroline does this and Lizzie gets very that is not true at all, and that she does it herself. But that is kind of what they're doing, that in society, again, having this conversation about people make an assumption about someone based off one interaction, like a first impression. Again, this book was initially titled First Impression. You make this assumption of their entire life and their personality and character based off one action or a family, not getting to really know the genuine person. I think that's what Jane Austen's trying to get at with this book, is that you need to get to know the person, because you might be wrong based off your first impression on their family background or one action. As I previously mentioned, there are many instances where this book feels relatable to today, not just characters, but also conversations being had, such as Mr. Bingley immediately offered to fetch her others, meaning books, all that his library afforded, and I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever looked into. And what is being said here, I think Jane Austen is trying to have a conversation about putting it to you in your face, is this idea of books being used to represent one's wealth and status, but never once looking to it. Because buying books at that time was an expense because often, especially if you're upper class, you would get them personally bound to match in a particular way. Like you kind of had to bind your own books. And there's this whole process of things, but it can be expensive. That's why, like, for example, Jane Austen used the rotating library where you would have this like library system where like you would share because you couldn't always afford to buy your own. And here, Bingley, at least tongue in cheek, makes fun of himself, acknowledging that he wished that he had